Great. Hi, everyone. This is Max, and I'm here today with the European Time Zone Meetup group. And we are going to be discussing the poem Two Friends by David Ignatow. So I'm going to read it real quick, and then we'll get into the conversation. Two friends. I have something to tell you. I'm listening. I'm dying. I'm sorry to hear. I'm growing old. It's terrible. It is. I thought you should know, of course, and I'm sorry. Keep in touch. I will, and you too. And let me know what's new. Certainly, though it can't be much. And stay well, and you too. And go slow, and you too. So it's a short poem, a dialogue, right? It seems to me to be a dialogue. Does anybody want to say in real simple terms what is happening here in this poem? Like, what is the story? What is the plot? If the poem can have a plot, what would it be?
I would say this poem, which was a really good choice, Mary, arrived the day after a WhatsApp message I'd had from a friend. And in my message to her, I'd said that I was feeling ill and I thought I was going to get worse. And I'd ended with one little positive thing. And I had this reply, great to hear from you, fantastic that everything's really well. And I'm thinking it's an exact mirror of this poem, that your friends, not intentionally, but a lot of them hear what they want to hear or see what they want to see, which might be totally out of sync with what's actually going on.
So it's a conversation between two friends, one of whom is not grasping the gravity of what the other is telling them, something like that.
Yes, but I think it has two layers as well. There's the layer that I experienced, which is what was going on now. And then there's the other layer, because actually we're all dying all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a second way of looking at this poem, I think.
Sure, that starts to get a little more, that starts to get a little bit more philosophical, existential, right? Does anybody else want to take a stab at what this, like what the scene is? I mean, do we have any evidence as to where these people are or who they are?
It doesn't feel, sorry, I was going to say, it doesn't feel as though they're face to face. It feels more as though they're communicating without seeing each other.
So like the WhatsApp message that Jenny was,
or a phone, or yes,
could be a phone call.
Maybe, yeah.
Oh, I think definitely a phone call, because the second line is "I'm listening." From the person who then goes on to prove they're not listening at all to actually what they're being told.
Right. So maybe a phone call, and you're assuming that these people are friends. Is there any kind of evidence? I mean, so friends, maybe, is there any more evidence about their relationship or who they are, maybe separate of their relationship?
It feels a bit distanced, as though they've either maybe were close friends once, but haven't really been that close now.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought the same thing.
Just in the style of the way they're talking to each other.
But there's also this line, I thought you should know. And generally, I would say that if you say like, I think you should know, or I thought you should know, you want that person to kind of be caught up with what's happening with you. So there is some kind of either like residual closeness, or they're still kind of friends. But I would actually disagree that the other person isn't listening. I think they are listening, but the problem is, and I think like the way I read this poem, is that death, especially the death of in progress, the death that is coming of somebody you care about, is just difficult to make sense of. And so no matter what you say, it's not going to make sense. You're not going to reply in the way that actually like honors the gravity of the situation, because you either make it like even sadder for the person, or you say something, as in that poem, that kind of like almost sounds disregarding. and kind of surface level. I just think that this poem shows really well how difficult it is to actually grasp death, and how difficult it is both for the person who is dying and for the person who is told that they're dying, that like, this is it. This is like one of their last conversations. And what do you do with that?
Or maybe they do grasp it, and it's actually quite hard to deal with it. So yeah.
Is it really a dialogue? I mean, we only have half of the dialogue. The speaker who writes down what he's saying, and we do not get the answers or the replies by the other person.
But we do get
We do, though.
it appears to be a dialogue.
Oh, I think I've read it like you did, Mark, for when I read it for the first time, that I thought it was just one part of the conversation, but
Right.
I actually now think it's both parts. It's
Oh, okay.
one person saying something and another is answering.
Oh.
But when I read it for the
now that
first
you
time,
mention it.
when I read it for the first time, I really thought that as well, Mark. I thought it was just one part of a conversation.
Yeah, same. When I was reading it for the first time, I thought, oh, this is just like one part of a conversation and we have to like fill in the blanks.
Right.
Mm.
And it took me like a couple of reads to figure out, oh, that the answers are just not marked. You kind of have to make sense of it as well.
Interestingly, I had a different reading. It might be an ignorant reading. Sure, it says two friends, but I thought I was reading them as separate lines, as though it wasn't a dialogue the first time. And then I realized, hey, this is a dialogue. But it's interesting to consider. I think how you read something that later you learn is incorrect is also an interesting thing to consider, nonetheless.
This is an interesting take, actually. This is a fun mild controversy about whether the two parts of the dialogue are represented, or if this is kind of like when you just hear somebody on the phone and you're just hearing one person speak.
Right.
And looking at it again, yeah, it kind of goes both ways. And maybe that ambiguity is part of the point of the poem. I mean, maybe that's something to explore a little bit further. I just want to go back real quick to Tan's point. Tan, you were saying so the reading you just offered, where you see the friend as being maybe a little bit more sympathetic, that's following from reading these as separate lines of dialogue, right? Even though you said that you were reading, when you first read this, you read this as kind of like a transcript of just one side of the conversation.
I think it would go like, I think that my interpretation of it would go either way.
Sure.
Because if you read it as one person, just one part of the dialogue that you hear, you don't know what the other person is saying, but the answers are very short and clipped, which is, again, like, how do you explain to somebody you love that you're dying? Like, how do you deal with that? And how do you respond to their, sympathy or grief or what have you? Like, you cannot do that, really. And if it is a dialogue, then it's kind of the same thing. How can you respond to this? So I think it kind of works either way.
I think what the line that is so striking for me is, say, let me know what's new. And then certainly, though it can't be much, so my time is limited, can't be much. But then the worst part, like a dagger for me, is stay well. It's just as though they weren't really listening to each other. Because
I would actually disagree with you here, Mary, because like as a disabled person and chronically ill person, like when you call somebody or like, on the phone, you're like, I've been like spending 2 weeks in bed. I got out of the house like on Monday. And when you talk to people being, having one of the worst 2 weeks of this year so far, it's like, oh, I hope you get better. I hope you're being well. I hope you're like, not feeling too down in the dumps. And say, no, that's exactly how I'm feeling. But the person they cannot really conceptualize it properly. Like they hear it, they understand kind of like on an intellectual level, but they truly cannot conceptualize what it feels like. So they're listening, but again, what is your capacity for listening?
If,
Not
if,
much.
if it's alternating between the two friends, the person saying it switches from I thought you should know, of course, and I'm sorry, keep in touch is presumably the person who's dying if we go at every other line. And then
No, I think it's
no,
the
let me know what's new, then switches to the other person, doesn't it? If it's, don't know, just trying to work it out.
I've just put little because I read it the first time as two friends as a dialogue.
Yeah.
I marked it up because it's
Yeah.
easy to read it as just a transcript of one person speaking, and actually that does alter what you're reading in the poem. But I think the poet is doing that deliberately so that you decide as the reader what it is that you're witnessing.
Yeah.
So I think the dying person says, I have something to tell you. I'm dying. I'm growing old. It is, I thought you should know. I will, and you too. Certainly, though it can't be much. And you too, is how I read.
Which would then mean that keep in touch, although it's all run into that same line, would be the other person, wouldn't it? But that seems to have been deliberately run onto I thought you should know, and I'm sorry. Which would then mean I will and you too was the other person, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, is that intentional, that very long stretch in the middle with keep in touch?
I want to press pause for a second to welcome Nancy, who's joining us, and to let you know, Nancy, that we're in the middle of discussing David Ignatow's Two Friends poem. We started about 15 minutes ago, so we're in the thick of it. Sorry, Sharon. Yeah, but I think that the right. So if we read this as a dialogue where each line is a different speaker, then we have this interpretation in the middle of the poem, and I'm backing up from like a line or two that you were just talking about, Sharon. We have this, the initial exchange where all the meaning is deriving from. I'm dying. I'm sorry to hear, which Jenny said at the beginning seems like a kind of like deflating thing to say, right? You say, I don't know, I'm sorry to hear, but as Tan pointed out, that perhaps that's in fact like, the most one can do. So we have this kind of complexity here around like how the different kinds of responses to this sort of news, this kind of bad news. If we read it as a transcript of one side of the conversation, it becomes far more complex and bizarre. Why is the person apologizing immediately after sharing this news about their death or their, that the fact that they're dying? What has the person on the other end said? And I guess the folks who read this initially as one side of a conversation, I read it initially as two sides of the conversation. So this is why, I find this so fascinating. I don't know. I guess it's sort of part of the complexity of this poem. But I would invite the folks who read this initially as just one side of the conversation to maybe say something about how they understood this apology that comes right after the sharing of the news that the speaker is dying.
Is it about death? I mean, all sentences are clipped. They are quite short. These aren't real fragments, but it's close to fragment. What about an ellipsis? I'm dying for the latest news. Yeah, and that would be not about death, but anyhow, it must be some bad news, because then it goes on. I'm sorry to hear. So it is about bad news, but not necessarily death.
I agree.
Sure. Okay.
I agree. I actually, when I read it for the first time, I actually thought it was more of like a cry for attention. The sentence "I'm dying," it was to me kind of taken back in the line "I'm growing old." It was like, well, I'm dying, I'm feeling so bad. And then maybe the person on the other line, if we read it like it's just one person, then the person on the other line said something really, really tragic, like someone who's actually dying. And then they're like, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't really mean that. I'm not actually dying. I'm just growing old. That
Okay.
was how I read it for the first time.
I
So
read it
they-
differently.
Oh, go ahead, Don.
I don't know, I've just had conversations similar to this, not like in the way of like I'm dying, but in the way of that both of the people are experiencing something very heavy and tragic. And so to me, for example, like if I look at the, text again, it's like one person is dying and that is heavy and has gravity to it, but the other person has something going on too. And so I felt, and I read it in a way that like the speaker is both apologizing for bringing like their bad news. I mean, like, well, sorry for like burdening you on top of, your own bullshit with something that is happening in my life. And they both, to me, when I was reading it for the first time, it read as they both don't quite know how to react to each other's grief. Different things. One person is dying and another person's life, something else is going on. Maybe also somebody's dying. And I've had a lot of these conversations in the like midst of the heaviest lockdown. Of like, how are you doing? Not well. How are you doing? Also terrible. What are we going to say about it?
But what really surprised me here was when he said, oh, this in the middle, of course, and I'm sorry, then keep in touch sounds as though the person saying I'm sorry wants to terminate the conversation. Because usually you say keep in touch at the very end, like all the best or hope, hope, whatever. And I thought that was very strange right there in the middle. It sounds as though that person doesn't want to hear anymore and just wants to cut it off.
So I want to bracket what you said for a second, Mary, because I think that's a really good point, and just run with Mark's point from a second ago about how this poem doesn't necessarily have to be about death or bad news, and in fact, yeah, the I'm dying is in fact like it could be an exaggeration or a sort of call for attention, as Yunya was saying. It's also like it's colloquial. I'm dying of laughter, right? Or I'm, like this. There's no reason why this couldn't be a funny conversation, right? To some extent, where this person is calling up and saying, like, I have something to tell you, and the person on the other line is like, no, hold on, I've got something to tell you first, and they say, okay, I'm listening, and then it's something very funny, and the first person is like, oh my God, I'm dying, but then at some point, we're doing a lot of work here to reconstruct this conversation, but there's no reason why it couldn't be a colloquial use of dying happening there. And Mary, what you just said a moment ago put me in mind of how if we read this as one side of the conversation, there's a kind of like insistence of like of staying on the line, of a kind of desire to not get off the line, right? And the kind of like this repetition of, okay, you two, okay, you, yeah, and you, this sort of like, you hang up first kind of thing. Which reminds me, of course, of the Sid Corman poem, It Isn't for Want of Something to Say, which is very much about this, like, as Sid Corman says in the poem, I'm trying to detain you, like this is, don't hang up just yet. Like, I want you to stay on the line, the metaphorical line.
It also makes me think of, shamefully, I can't remember the poem that was written to a friend that was dying with each sentence ending in ...
Chronic meanings.
Yeah, that one, which, that's sort of filling in the blanks.
Sure.
Feeling.
It does have a bit of that.
Somebody mentioned ellipses earlier, but if you had that at the end, it would have that same, sense of something hanging there.
Right, and that of course the chronic meanings poem in the context of the ModPo syllabus is presented as an elegy, and there's something we can read something elegiac into this poem as well. The two friends. Should we go with the more literal interpretation of the news of the death of the speaker, rather than the kind of comic, not literal interpretation of the death that I just proposed following Mark's suggestion?
Do you think it's intentional that the first half of it is I all the way through, and then it goes to and, which is much more of a sort of less determined and more
Yes,
holding
and it switches to another pronoun, namely you. It starts with I. I mean, in the first sentence we also have the pronoun you, but the you occurs more often, starting with I will and you too, and then that's the second half of the poem.
Yeah, I will, you too. Yeah, yeah.
It reminds me of the beginning of Song of Myself, Walt Whitman, who also starts with I, and then he switches to you.
So what kind of gesture is that? Like what is, you know, what sort of move is that? How do we understand that in the course of this short poem? This is clearly very intentional, like to go from these I statements, these sort of expressions of the ego to these you statements that are a little bit more open-ended, especially following on what you were just saying a second ago, Sharon, about the end, which is, you know, a conjoining conjunction. So there's always the invitation with the end to piece more things to it. So what is this turn from these short clipped I statements to these kinds of maybe open-ended, frayed at the end and statements?
Can I give a structural suggestion? Maybe you talk about I when you're saying hello, and you talk about you when you're saying goodbye.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what is maybe Ignatow saying about conversations in this poem? Whether we're reading it as, because it works whether we're reading it as one side of a conversation or as a dialogue, right? It works both ways. So what is maybe being said about conversations here with that kind of turn in tone? You know, the I when you say hello, the you when you say goodbye. Sorry, Mary. What were you gonna say?
It's like stock phrases. They have to keep in touch. They don't know how to say anything anymore because it's terrible. And so they just said, well, you say, well, you too, go slow. It's like a little coda. They put on a coda just to finish up the conversation somehow with stock phrases.
I agree. And I also think I read it as a very egocentric, imbalanced thing, because at first, I mean, someone is calling someone up and they are only talking about themselves. They're not asking questions. And I think that's they're two friends. There should be a certain balance in their conversation. They should be asking, well, how are you doing? What are you doing in your free time? How are you feeling? But instead they're just talking about themselves, and I'm dying, and well, I'm growing old. At least that's how I interpreted it. And I think after they got this off their chest and they're like, well, okay, I think there's nothing to talk about now. And then they're finishing up the conversation, which I think is, I mean, it just made me think about what is friendship in general, if that's how conversations go, because I think it's very relatable in a way.
Relatable in that we've all experienced a one-sided conversation with a friend. Yeah,
Definitely.
I had a slightly different take on the I's and then the U's, because I think keep in touch is the hinge of the poem. So the first, whether it's one person speaking, I'm listening, or two, it's when you're starting a conversation and you're trying to get your bit in, like I'm doing this, this is happening to me, and then you get to keep in touch, and then there's a kind of more of a meeting. It's like, oh, you too, and you know, stay well, and you too, and so they're coming together. Perhaps that's my take on it, anyway.
but so you said, Caroline, the keep in touch for you is the turn of the poem, and you're saying that because that's where we switch from the I statements to the you statements.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also from a structured part to an unstructured part, I mean, the anaphora emphasizes the repetition of and. When do we use and? We use and when we want to add something. It's not really structured, and then we add the next idea because we hadn't really thought about the idea that we're trying to express. So to me, keep in touch is either a turning point or it is the end of the conversation, and then they do not really want to split up, and they would like to continue their conversation, and then they add ideas what they hadn't really thought about.
The strange one to me is the second line from the bottom, and go slow, which doesn't seem all that well to relate to anything.
Unless it means don't die too quickly.
Well, unless it means don't die too quickly. But it's quite a curious line when you read it in the middle of that sort of sequence of banalities. And go slow kind of stands out as one that wouldn't necessarily be the go-to thing that you'd say in that kind of string of things to say.
It's an interesting like revision of the Dylan Thomas line, "Do not go gentle into that good night," right? It's like yeah, take it easy, go slow, you know, go gentle into that good night or something.
All right, yep.
The conversation about the sort of structural evolution of this and what Caroline was just saying about keep in touch, I mean, put me in mind of another sort of or maybe think of another sort of structural analog for this poem. I mean, is there anything that's standing out about the form of this poem, the way it looks, the way it's structured, that seems reminiscent of anything?
Well, like the first thing I thought about was actually similar to what Sharon said before, which is chronic meanings.
Sure,
It really reminded me of chronic meanings, and that those like clipped sentences. But the difference is in chronic meanings, there was, as far as I remember, which is I don't remember if there were any like stopping points in the line. And here, every line is specifically finished.
Right.
So it's not like a birthday ending. It's that's it. Like that's the sentence. And what's interesting to me about this poem is that it is somehow clear that it is some kind of dialogue, whether it is like one-sided or double-sided, but the speakers are not marked, and all of the sentences are final. So they're final, and they are all very short. And the last, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences are all the same structure. So they're all 3-word sentences.
Right.
And incomplete sentences. No verb.
Yeah, they're like a response to something. Yeah.
And they have rhymes. You too, go slow, and then again you too. The only lines that have rhymes.
So these last few lines all seem to kind of belong together, and they all seem to follow this turning point around keep in touch. And so I was looking for if anybody wanted to compare this to a more traditional form.
I mean, it really reminds me, and it's not like a strict, was very structured, but it really reminds me of a sonnet.
Totally.
In how it's structured and how it's rhymed. So like the last, in the traditional Shakespeare sonnet is the last 2 lines, I think. Here it's the last 4. And there are actual rhymes within the poem itself. So like, keep in touch, I will, and you too, and let know what's new. I think that there is like a pronoun missed, like let me know or let you know. It's not quite clear. So that's an interesting line to me. And then again, like certainly though it can't be much. So much touch, tune you, There is also a rhythmic structure to it.
And that's very much the rhyming pattern there of a sonnet where you have like an ABBA structure with the keep in touch, I will and you too, and let know what's new, certainly, though it can't be much. If you read it, if you force the iambic rhythm a little bit, it starts to come out a little more as a sonnet.
And also this ABBA rhyme scheme of keep in touch, to, new, much, the line touch and much embraces the two lines in between, like two friends. Keep in touch, that could be the ending, and then they embrace the following two lines, and then they split up.
Doesn't the sonnet also have like a twist or a turn at the end?
Yeah, the volta.
Exactly.
Right.
Where would that be if we had to pinpoint like a line?
Turning point, keep in touch.
Keep in touch.
That's what Caroline had identified earlier as a possible turning point. It's obviously not a strict sonnet. It's like slightly imbalanced in that. I mean, here you have 15 lines, but if you read this line in the middle as one long and jammed line, it is. I thought you should know, of course, and I'm sorry, keep in touch. If you read that as all one line across the page, which is, I think, we're invited to do by the enjambment of you should know, of course, then it's 14 lines.
Shakespeare has
that is how you read it, by the
15
way.
lines, so it doesn't really matter whether our sonnet has 14
Sure,
lines or
sure.
15 lines.
Yes,
And I mean, also keep in touch, which we identified as turning point or volta, that's line 8. And also in Shakespeare, you often have the volta in line 8.
Sure, and then the rest is the
Sestet.
thank you. Yeah.
Octave and sestet.
Right. That kind of the button, the sort of what when the poem sort of like inverts on itself and has and kind of presents a different idea. Kurt, were you going to say something?
I forget what it was, but I'm not so familiar with these technical terms. But the other keep in touch as a turning point is interesting, but also the right after that, I will and you too. It's the only sentence with I and you in it.
Mm.
So you could maybe keep that as part of the turning point. But yeah, I just wanted to say, I think what I said is that's how you read it, Max. I think I noticed that you put those two lines together. And in fact, that makes another aspect that's interesting is does that mean you're switching what you think the person is? Person A is all of a sudden become person B.
Mm.
And that might even be another theme because you say we're all alike, sometimes.
Sure. That's a good point, Kurt, about that line, I will and you too, where there's a kind of handing off of the pronouns, where the I and you too, like we're together here, but now you is taking the rest of the poem, and something has been sort of exchanged. Yeah, there's a lot to say about this. Is there I mean, what is this poem saying about friendships? We started to, Unia, you started us on this topic a little bit, and Jenny at the very beginning, you talked about this as well. And what is this poem saying about friendship, about relationships, about relating? I mean, does this poem have a comment to make about that? Or is it just an anecdote? Is it just a sort of slice of life about, this kind of conversation between two people, two former friends, one sharing some heavy news and the other maybe at a loss for what to say? Or is it meant to be, is it meant as a kind of statement on relating in general?
Before we just go on to your question, Nancy, I'm not sure that your audio's on because we haven't heard you say anything at all.
Oh,
Your
Nancy,
audio's
you're muted now, Nancy.
Right, my audio was off, but I haven't said anything anyway. So it's okay.
Oh, well, that's all right. Okay.
I did have something to say to Max's question.
Oh, please go for it.
with regards to friends and also how friends talk with each other. Somebody else mentioned how it is that we talk. How does it sound? What does friendship sound like? And then also with regards to the form, if you turn the poem on its side, there's a wall between the two speakers, between I and you. And I thought there's that little valley there where I will and you too, where they're starting to separate, and then the wall grows up and they can't, and they never can get around it. I thought, so that's kind of, but also it's all like you said, there's no questions. Nobody's asking any questions. They're just interested in talking about themselves, or they're not close enough to ask a question. Maybe somebody calls you up that you don't know very well and they say, hey, yo, I'm dying. And you're like, oh gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. But you have nothing really to say because you don't know that person very well. So you feel like, no, it's hard to say, well, what are you dying of? Well, what did the doctor say? Well, what medicine did he give you? You know, that all those things that real friends, maybe they're not even two real friends. Maybe they're just two people who act like friends.
Right, details are missing.
Yeah. So anyway, that was what I had to say.
Your point of the barrier is making me think of Robert Frost's Mending Wall, which has been interpreted in ModPo as being a statement, a sort of playful, puckish statement by Frost on the actual impossibility of knowing what another thinks, of some sort of intersubjective mind meld or something like that, which I think is that kind of helps us pose another question about this poem in particular, which is this poem, does it share in that philosophy? If we're trying to talk about friendship, I mean, is this poem saying that two people are always going to be two separate entities, two different subjectivities who can never quite know what the other is saying and never quite fully understand what the other is going through, right? Which is sort of what we're saying a little bit about not being able to fully understand, say, when somebody tells you they're dying, right? That's not an experience you can have. So you're always going to be at a remove. So is this poem kind of falling in the Frost camp of things, of saying like it's actually impossible to fully understand what somebody's going through? Or is it saying something different? Is it challenging that and saying, in fact, no, there is a way you can understand that, like the I and the you don't have to be separated. They can share space, like they do in that one line, I will and you too. And yeah, so I would just invite some interpretations. Does anybody want to interpret this one way or the other, that this is a kind of poem that's like pro intersubjectivity, as we might say, that has a kind of like an idea where people can actually really intimately know one another? Or is it saying like, no, this is impossible to actually empathize with something like this?
I would say that the
Well,
point
certainly.
is that it's, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, Tan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I think that the point to me that the poem is trying to make is that it's challenging to relate to each other, even if you are friends, even if there is some kind of relationship that you have. It's just challenging sometimes. People have some experiences that you will not get, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't like try to. And in the way that I read that poem, like the speakers, they're trying to relate to each other. It's just that the topic is so, I don't know, difficult, that their attempts are not quite adequate. And yet there's still that relation. There's still, I don't know, an impulse to try and reach out, to try and react, to try and say something. Is just not adequate necessarily. And then when they share the space, right, as Mark said in that line, there is that moment of like connect, like I see what you're doing and you kind of understand what I'm going through to a degree that you can. Now let's wrap it up.
Mark, did you have a comment to make a second ago?
Yes, I don't think that Two Friends is as explicit as Frost's Mending Wall. There's this wonderful line good fences make good neighbors, and we do not have this wall, this barrier, this fence in this poem. But what makes it strange is that details are missing. I'm dying, no matter whether that person is really dying or is dying for the latest news, and then he gets some bad news. Details are missing. Usually, when we're close friends and somebody tells us something bad or gives us bad news, we're interested in the details. How did it come? What happened? What is the reason why you're dying or why you're feeling so bad? And that's something that's completely missing.
And is that absence, is the lack of information, does it mean that they have a close relationship, or is it saying that information, I mean, is it meant to represent an unequal relationship between these two people, or maybe a disinterested relationship, or I mean, it's hard to understand what that sort of lack of information would be, right?
I thought of this poem as a fragmented poem. The lines, they aren't really fragmented, and there are only a few lines that are incomplete sentences, but each line is something like a sentence. It ends with a full stop, with a period. It's fragmented. A lot is missing.
Yes, I agree. And I think that's why I was really struggling to kind of agree with like the speaker or the author in a way that they are friends, because I was really questioning that at the end of the conversation. Because on the one hand, I'm really conflicted with this. On the one hand, I think all the periods and just the breaks, which I interpreted as like huge silences, could just mean that they are really comfortable with each other and that they just enjoy each other's company more than they actually enjoy the conversation, which I think sometimes happens with friends. But on the other hand, I think the poem makes me really uncomfortable with all these silences and all these full stops. And I think especially with what you all mentioned with keep in touch, is like the break that someone tries to wrap the conversation up when it's just in the middle. That just makes the whole atmosphere really uncomfortable for me. And I think that would kind of point to them not being friends, actually. So I think it's really interesting that you could interpret it in both ways. And like I said, I really think it questions friendship in general.
And thinking of the wall thing as well. In the mending wall, it's really one neighbour has to do it for tradition's sake. It's a tradition that the one neighbour feels has to be done, so the other one goes along with it. And there's in that line, I thought you should know, of course, it's almost like I feel obligated, as though there's a rather than for a real. It's got that same sense of feeling that there's some reason why you feel you ought to be letting the other person know, rather than it doesn't feel like it's because you really care about the person, more that it's an obligation to let the other person know.
Yes, but the first sentence, I have something to tell you. To whom do we express such sentences? Only to friends. Certainly not to strangers.
Sure. It's not a stranger. Although, you know, that sort of takes us into the meta reading, which I'll get to in a quick second. I was wondering if anybody wanted to connect some of what we're saying about how this poem is representing friendship, or a kind of friendship, to what kicked off our conversation, which was the revelation that this can be read two different ways, either as one side of a conversation or as a dialogue. So what is the ambiguity of the nature of this, the nature of the dialogue in this poem? What is that saying about, or how does that color our impression of the friendship that's being represented here? Obviously, if it's if it's a poem called Two Friends and it's one side of a conversation, that says a lot about a kind of unequal friendship, right? But it seems very intentionally to be able to be read two different ways. So I think that Ignatow is making a more, as a far more nuanced point about friendship happening here. Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
But could I try? I think right away he says, I'm the other person. I'm listening. But the ironic part is he's not really listening. Whoever it is isn't thoroughly listening. It's just superficially listening. Okay.
Right. No. Whether we read it as one side of a conversation or as a dialogue, no one's really listening there, I guess, right? Whether it's the other person responding or if it's the same person saying like, okay, I'm listening, because you're saying something first. You know, the unrepresented part. Tan?
I think that what's interesting is that I just got this thought, and it might be like totally out of the left field, but if you can interpret that poem both as a dialogue and as like something that, you know, a one-sided conversation, it doesn't matter if it's a dialogue or it's a one-sided conversation, because there's no real dialogue happening then. It's either just like, you know, like you sitting in the room with another dude and just like overhearing the conversation, and that's all you're getting. Or you're hearing the actual dialogue, and that's all that you're getting too. The result is exactly the same. So in that case, does it really matter how we read it? Because the outcome kind of ends up being very similar.
Yeah.
You know, but also a thought that I had when Mark was saying about like short clipped sentences and a lot of details missing, I kind of started wondering whether it's possible that it's an overheard conversation. So like we don't get the details because we're overhearing it.
It's very like probably only the ones in the UK will know, but Alan Bennett's overhearing conversations between people on a bus, where he jots down snippets that he's heard between two people sitting on a bus. And
yeah, exactly. You're not gonna get like all of the details because you're just kind of there.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about like, because the author and the speaker are not the same thing. So like, I started asking myself a question like, why do I think, or why do I read it as a transcript of a conversation, like word by word, verbatim, instead of just like snippets that stood out, maybe?
That reading would also explain the limits of this poem in space or in time. I mean, when you're on a bus, your conversations have to be quick because someone will get off, and that will end also on the conversation. And then the keep in touch, that could be the bus has arrived at the right stop, and but the doors aren't open, and then they try to continue the conversation. It really makes sense.
Yeah, you could read it like that.
I had a
Okay, and now for the metapoetic reading, the reader, and the poet.
I had a question for us to think about.
Yeah.
Is this a man or two men speaking, or is it two women, or a man and a woman, or do we not know, and does it not matter?
Right, does it matter? I would say no.
Yeah, it seems to not matter, and that there's not too much evidence. I mean, I suppose you could start reading in a gendered relationship between these two participants in this conversation, and that would add a certain color to the poem. But I'm not. I feel like that information is intentionally suppressed, or left out in this kind of pursuit of a sort of kind of like a very minimalist poem that's trying to make a point about like language, which is I think why it invites a sort of meta poetic reading as well. Tan, the point you made about whether if the speaker, whether it's a dialogue or a one side of a conversation, it doesn't matter because clearly this person, they were just going to say whatever they're going to say. I think that kind of goes to, right, that kind of goes to Yunya's point about this being this seeming to be a kind of like one-sided relationship, which is a way of kind of building up to the, I'm just recapping this as a way of building up to the meta-poetic reading, because Mark, you said a moment ago, this is, you don't share news with perfect strangers like this. It's got to be between two friends or people who believe they're friends. But we're interposing in this conversation in some way, right? We're either as the readers, we're either overhearing it, or we're in a way we're invited to be we're the you. Either way, we're kind of strangers who are being made privy to this news, right? So I guess, I don't know how to phrase this question. Does anybody want to take a stab at a meta-poetic reading? Are we the view of this?
I think Caroline's question is interesting, actually, because it's a poem by a man.
Sure.
And if you took the kind of stereotypes that we don't talk about today, you might want to put a gender on the poem. And then there's the question of, would a man write from a man's point of view because that's what he knows? Or could he write from a woman's point of view? So I think there is something in this question, but I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
I think I asked the question because as we've been discussing it, I realized that I heard it as male voices, and the fact that as Marcus said, that they don't do what you would expect. They don't say, "Oh, what's the doctor said?" How have things been? That there's not that meeting that I would hope in my conversations with female friends. If I said I'm dying, I would hope that they would come back and be more empathetic. And there's no empathy in this poem.
Right.
Apart from the keep in touch line.
More I think about it, I also think that it's stereotypical for male conversations.
I read it as two men. I don't know why, but
It's yeah. These are good points, and it makes me think that it's a kind of like, it's like taciturn dudes like talking about serious stuff. Right, like two Hemingways being like, "I'm dying. I know. Okay, cool." Like something, this inability to kind of connect on that level, and I suppose, yeah, if you do actually want to run with that and introduce that reading, it complicates the earlier question I made about intersubjectivity. It complicates that from a kind of from a standpoint of let's say gendered notions or expectations around something like empathy or sympathy, and maybe this kind of divide, this wall, as Nancy put it, is like that's existing in this particular gendered relationship between two men. We're understanding them as men here because of a perceived lack of like empathy and a kind of like taciturn, stiff upper lip kind of thing, right?
Makes me kind of, excuse me, Max, that makes me kind of wonder then if it's not a conversation between a man and a woman, and that this wall that's there is the woman expecting an empathy. She says, "I'm dying," and he's like, "Whoa, sorry to hear that. Gosh, gotta go." That there's maybe a disappointment because at the end there is an attempt to try to keep it together, and maybe that.
So
I still feel the dying, one way to look at the "I'm dying," you could almost see it as a Woody Allen character, I'm dying, we're all dying. But I think that's pretty important because in the later line he says, "I'm growing old." So it seems like he's justifying the dying as that's all life is. We're nearly, we're just growing old and dying. So this whole idea that it's supposed to be a sad thing, I'm not getting. And then also, what do we say in conversation? "How you doing?" "Fine." It actually is somehow meaningless. So you suppose this is a stylized conversation. "How you doing?" "I'm dying." "Yeah, we all are." Isn't that another way to look at it?
Yeah.
Mhm. It is.
We could also understand this as if we go with the one-sided reading, that this is a male speaker on the phone with a woman on the other end, and there's this need for there's almost like wheedling need for comfort or attention that's going on, like trying to get some sort of validation or something from the other person, and whether or not it works, we're not really sure because we're not getting that other side of the conversation. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of different ways to kind of understand who the different actors are in this poem, how serious they are about this conversation. So are we? I think maybe we can try to come to a sort of conclusion here and spend a couple minutes with the Walt Whitman. Are we the you? Are we feeling that way reading this, or no? Is this a one-sided conversation where we're in fact we're not really invited into that you that appears at the end of the poem? Is this a very ego poem that's like where we feel actually that wall between the I and the you, and we can't really like identify too much with the speaker, or are we in fact interpolated and addressed at the end?
But it's just that I think it's like what you asked before about metapoetic poem.
Yeah,
I think it's metapoetic in the sense that if you really listen, you listen. It's a question of not close listening, no close listening. A poem about not listening.
so it's a poem about not listening. Is it
Or not listening well.
is it enacting that not listening? I mean, it's showing us like one side. So maybe one way of doing the metapoetic reading is to kind of follow from what I was saying a moment ago, where this is a one-sided conversation and we're just kind of blocked out of it, and that's how the poem is doing what it says or something.
Yeah.
By the way, different thing a little bit, because I don't remember who said that, unfortunately, but it was in our earlier discussion just a little bit ago that like we don't share something like, oh, I'm dying with people we don't know. And I immediately thought, well, we as writers do.
Yeah.
Like as writers, we literally like publish poems about something insanely personal, and then some random, person whom we don't know then picks up a manuscript or reads it somewhere, what have you, and relates to it somehow. There's no real way for us to connect, but there is some kind of reaction to it anyway. And so I feel like there is an opportunity to read it as a metapoetic, like in a metapoetic way, in a way that this is an author connecting with the reader in a way that is possible, because there is a literal wall between the author and the reader, and in terms of a page, to which you cannot really respond. You can only get like one side of a conversation, and then the rest of the conversation basically happens in you. As for example, we right now, analyzing the poem and reading it closely and arguing about how to read it. But ultimately, if not for these meetings, the same kind of situation would be happening inside of yourself as a reader. So I think it kind of is also a comment on the relationship between the reader and the writer and the interconnection between them.
Absolutely. That's fantastic, Tom. Anybody want a second?
No, I would like to agree completely. What came to my mind is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who writes in Nature about this dialogue between author or poet, as he calls that, and the reader. Together with the reader, although you aren't here. That's that's a paraphrase of what he says, and this is the same that we have here. Two friends, the poet and the reader. They have to be friends, and the poet starts with, "I have something to tell you." So I, that's the poet, and the you, that is the reader. But then the next bit doesn't really make sense. But when we consider Ralph Waldo Emerson again with that situation that it is a dialogue, although one person is missing, either the reader isn't there when the poet is writing, or the reader, the poet isn't there when the reader is reading the poem, and somebody must be listening. And also poets try to tell us things that we are interested in. They are listening to us. Or is it the reader who's listening to the poet who writes the poem?
Yeah.
Excellent. It's yeah, this
And the wall also makes sense because one person is there but not the other. Either you have the poet writing the poem, or you have the reader reading the poem and the other person is missing.
Yeah, but then you said that the line "I'm listening" doesn't make any sense, but then you can read it as the message, like I have something to tell you, I'm listening.
And I'm listening, I'm reading.
Yeah, like I'm listening to you, I'm trying to connect to you through my work, and I'm like listening to whatever is happening around me, so I can't actually write something you can read. I feel like that might be read as the message, like I have something to tell you, this is what I have to tell you.
Oh, the message is I have something to tell you, I'm listening.
Yeah, like I have something to tell you, I'm listening.
It's like the FBI or something. Yeah, I have something to tell you, I'm listening. Yeah, no, that's pretty fantastic. So actually the I'm listening becomes the takeaway, the news of the poem, the important part of the poem, not the I'm dying, right? So you know, if we want to read this as a Sid Corman-esque poem, right, then it becomes this, like, it's like the poem is not, this poem about my death is not about, you know, the fact that I will cease to be is not as important as the fact that this poem will go on, and it will go on being a sort of dialogue between you and I, to an extent. I think it's far more radical in the Sid Corman poem, or at least the way we've interpreted it isn't for want of something to say, to detain you, and so forth. But here, you know, there might be a version of that happening here too, right? By saying that like my death, my end is not as important as the fact that I have something to tell you and I'm listening, right? It's
add on? Sorry, so I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, please go ahead.
To add on to that, what if we read it completely? Because I think that's a really interesting idea. What if we read it a little bit differently? I have something to tell you, I'm listening. I have something to tell you, I'm dying. I have something to tell you, I'm sorry to hear. I'm growing old. You know, and then because it works also then if you skip down and let me know what's new, certainly though it can't be much. And let me know what's new and stay well. And let me know what's new and you too. You know, then it also sort of, it could become like a conversation that the poet is having with us in different ways that he's trying to speak to us. I just thought that was really an interesting idea what you brought up, Tam. That's cool, thanks.
I have something to tell you and a series of things to tell you.
Yeah, but also if you also kind of come back to the structure of the poem, which we have kind of discussed, is not unlike a sonnet. It can be like what I thought about, what was that word? It can be read from stage. If it is a sonnet, my first association is like Shakespearean play, so it can be read from stage. And so it's kind of like a monologue, but it's a monologue at the audience. And I've read recently about like Shakespearean plays staged for inmates in the US prisons, and they were responding. And people would like shout, you know, from their chairs something, and the next line in you know, the character lines would make perfect sense, even though it is predisposed and pre-written to what the person said, because the reaction isn't like, you know, because it was written with the reader in mind. And so in that case, especially Nancy, if you're reading it like I have something to tell you, I'm listening, I have something to tell you, I'm dying, I have something to tell you, and then the second line as well, kind of like keep coming back to the first. On one hand, the writer cannot really like understand what we might say in response, but on the other hand, he kind of can. And so there is also that like point of dialogue that is one-sided, but also like, is it?
Yeah. Agree completely.
This was a good. Oh yeah, Kurt, go ahead. Yeah.
It's okay, meta-poetic. It may mean that somehow, for example, let's just say it means that somehow I become the second person, the one who says I'm listening. Now that's the less sensitive one, so we don't tend to do that. Often in screenwriting, we talk about identification, and we often identify with a person who's in a more in a less good situation. So you identify with the first person. But I did a little something yesterday that troubled me, that's self-critical about me. I was looking on YouTube watching the news, and they were talking about people dying. And I sort of clicked away. I said, okay, tragedy there. That's what the news is, tragedy, tragedy, tragedy. And here I am, I'm seeing myself as a second person, someone saying, I'm dying. Well, I'm sorry to hear. And I clicked somewhere else. So I don't know if that's answers your question about meta poetry, because in some sense you're saying with a text, somehow you are, I don't know how to say it. The text is talking for me, the reader. So that might be considered meta poetic, right?
Yeah. I mean, meta poetry as a analytic frame, I mean, it's pretty open-ended. It's usually when we try to arrive at an interpretation where the poem appears to be enacting what it means to say, a kind of like form function thing, which yeah. So something about like the news. Yeah, I mean, the way that it's engaging you, as you were just saying, I mean, I think that there's a sort of meta-poetic quality there, right? Where it's like, you know, where you feel to be in that position of being the person who says, I'm sorry to hear, or something.
Because to continue just a little second, we're all we're all stuck to the title two friends, but it could be a metaphorical friend. And maybe for me, my friend would be, it's me with humanity. Here that's talking about a tragedy in humanity. Well, humanity is a friend of mine, right? So we don't always have to stay literal that there's two men on a bus or whatever. All right?
You can take that even further to an invisible friend. You could take it to a conversation with yourself in your head.
I was thinking of that also, yes.
Yeah.
Should we take a moment or two to talk about the Walt Whitman passage from Specimen Days? With the like 25 minutes, 30 minutes we have allotted left. This was a fantastic conversation. Actually, this was really excellent, and I'm glad to have recorded it. And in fact, we went longer than I expected. That's what always happens, though. I should learn to adjust my expectations. But yeah, when it's a small poem like this that's kind of minimalist, I always expect it might go too quickly, but it didn't. Kind of like the Ruth Weiss poem we did. Did we do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a super short poem, and oh my God, it was like, you can talk about that forever. So it's February 19th, so we should talk about Walt Whitman's reflections on February 19th, 1870 something. I'm actually not entirely sure. It's published, I think, 1880s, 1890s.
It's 1878, according to the link you
Yeah,
sent.
that's on the diary entry.
Oh, is it on there? Oh, thank you.
top.
Okay, yeah, it's at the top. Geez, I don't know. I'm looking at the posted January 1st, 1892 thing on the side, which is hysterical that it's posted in 1892. Thank you. Yeah, 1878. Yeah, that's right at the top. So yeah, I figured we could just discuss this little piece of February 19th. I've posted it here in the chat. If you need it, it's right in the middle of the web page. And this is what Walt Whitman was, his diary entry from February 19th, 1878, published in the Specimen Days collection, which is a kind of grab bag prose collection that came out towards the end of his life. It's a collection of different memoirs and also these kinds of diary entries. I think it's most widely read for Whitman's reminiscences about the Civil War, which take up part of the book. And then this section, this diary entry, or this series of diary entries, is taken from another section of the book in which he's convalescing in southern New Jersey, where I grew up, so this is important to me. He's convalescing in South Jersey, outside of Camden and Philadelphia, where he lived in the 1870s following a stroke, I believe, and like a minor stroke. So he's older and he's just trying to get better. However, that was done in the 19th century. And he's on a farm here in rural South Jersey. And on February 19th, 1878, he wrote, "Cold and sharp last night, clear and not much wind. The full moon shining and a fine spread of constellations and little and big stars. Sirius, very bright, rising early, preceded by many orbed Orion, glittering, vast, sordid, and chasing with his dog. The earth hard frozen and a stiff glare of ice over the pond. Attracted by the calm splendor of the night, I attempted a short walk, but was driven back by the cold. Too severe for me also at 9 o'clock when I came out this morning, so I turned back again. But now, near noon, I have walked down the lane, basking all the way in the sun. This farm has a pleasant southerly exposure, and here I am seated under the lee of a bank close by the water. There are bluebirds already flying about, and I hear much chirping and twittering and 2 or 3 real songs, sustained quite a while in the midday brilliance and warmth. There, that is a true carol, coming out boldly and repeatedly as if the singer meant it. Then, as the noon strengthens, the reedy trill of the robin, to my ear the most cheering of bird notes. At intervals, like bars and breaks, out of the low murmur that in any scene, however quiet, is never entirely absent to a delicate ear, the occasional crunch and cracking of the ice glare congealed over the creek as it gives way to the sunbeams, sometimes with a low sigh, sometimes with indignant, obstinate tug and snort. And there's this addendum about Robert Burns. Robert Burns says in one of his letters, "There is scarcely any earthly object gives me more, I do not know if I should call it pleasure, but something which exalts me, something which enraptures me, than to walk in the sheltered side of a wood in a cloudy winter day and hear the stormy wind howling among the trees and raving over the plain. It is my best season of devotion." Some of his most characteristic poems were composed in such scenes and seasons. So Whitman is drawing a line between himself and Robert Burns, I guess. Although he's also Whitman is also very much in the tradition here of Thoreau and Emerson. Thoreau definitely with Walden here at his pond house, just writing about what he sees and hears and feels. But what did you all make of this? I just think it's fun because it's February 19th today. I have literally no other agenda than that. But
I had a question for the Americans here, because bluebirds to us just only appear once in a Vera Lynn's song about bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Robins I know about because we have them in the winter, but what do bluebirds mean? Are they an iconic American bird? Is the song?
I think that, I mean, not more iconic than not more iconic than the eagle, but I don't know. I'm not really sure what the bluebird is doing. I mean, or blue jays or what. I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the difference is.
I thought about that question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Kurt. Yeah.
No, I thought about that question recently because I noticed that in English they talk about blackbirds, and we don't talk about that in America. But bluebird, I think, isn't it? Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry, I confused it with blue jay. I was thinking blue jay is actually a species. Okay, but that's not. You're right. But blackbird, I don't think is a species, at least not in America. Does it mean crow? Does it mean raven?
No, it's a specific bird in England.
Oh, okay.
In England. A blackbird is. It's a very common garden bird. That it's not a term for the crows or coloured black birds that are coloured black.
Do we not have blackbirds in North America? I have
Well,
no clue.
Really, I don't
You
think.
don't have bluebirds?
Wally Stevens refers to blackbirds,
I know, right? Yeah, that's true. That's true.
which is Stevens, isn't it?
Yeah. No, you're totally right, Sharon. Yeah. No, Wallace Stevens has, of course, the famous poem.
Yes,
about the
but
blackbird.
Stevens was also in London for a long time.
That's true. Okay.
Sorry, I've sent us down a rabbit hole. Chasing
But no,
rabbits.
we have red-winged blackbirds in the U.S., of course. Yeah. That's what they're called because they're black, but they have a little like color under their wings or a certain part of their wings. Yeah. But I don't know if that's the same as this blackbird from the UK.
This Amsel that we have here. I don't know either. We have here in Germany, there's the Amsel. This is the blackbird I think that she's talking about. And it has a lovely song. I don't know about the red-winged blackbirds at home, whether that's the same bird or not. They're not red, they don't have red wings here. They're just,
Right. They don't have that stripe of color.
yeah, they have that beautiful orange beak. The boys do.
Oh yeah.
The gentlemen do.
You're a resident ornithologist now, but de facto.
I don't know about that. But I love them. I love them because we don't have them at home, and that's kind of.
If I looked out of the window now, there would be some in the neighbour's garden on the bird feeders. Definitely. I mean, they're here all the time, so very, very, but not red-winged. Anyway, sorry.
I don't remember ever seeing a bluebird in South Jersey in February, but then again, like I've never like looked at it. Again, I don't know anything about birds, so I think I probably haven't paid too much attention to birds in my life, unfortunately. I'm sorry to say no.
The only blue ones I know are blue jays, but I don't know about
blue jays, right?
I've just Googled bluebird US and for the Brits, they're a member of the thrush family.
Okay.
Which is a songbird that we would recognize. It's the fact he talks about them singing. And
how they got connected with Dover, I don't know, going back to Vera Lynn, but anyway, that's another.
One thing that's interesting, it sounds just like John Cage. As John Cage said, there's no such thing as silence. And he'd go around, for example, in the zoo and just take the sounds from the elephant, whatever, the monkeys. And this sounds just like John Cage. There's no silence. You're in the woods, it's silent, but it's not silent. And he's enjoying all these birds. It's really musical, chirping and twittering. And he says real songs. What's the difference between a false song and a real song?
Sure.
And then sustained quite a while. And then a true carol, and a real song, a true carol. And then he talks about the trill of the robin. Of course, the English have one robin and the Americans have another. The thrush robin is the American one, and that little, like the little one, like it's a British one. But the songs are gorgeous. And then bird notes. He talks about it as though we were discovering a world of real composition outside of human composition. Very interesting. Makes me think of John Cage.
The connection to Cage is that's interesting. And I was also thinking that as well. And I think that speaks to this tradition and in American aesthetics of heightening your awareness to what's ambient, to what's around you. And I think that's very much what Whitman is doing here. He's doing it through it's auditory here. But I think we can find examples. I mean, the Wallace Stevens poem about the blackbirds is also kind of an example of that, like finding what's aesthetic and like kind of what's around you. But yeah, Cage, of course, Cage's statements about listening to silence and things like that are like prime examples of a sort of radical version of that sort of heightened awareness to what's in the environment. Cage, being a composer, was interested in the sound and the music. And Whitman is doing a version of that here for sure. Is there anything that's curious about this passage as a diary entry, if we want to sort of think of it within the genre of diary?
Yeah, so what's curious is why you had chosen that extract. We're talking about American poetry, and now you give us prose. And the question is, Is it prose? Is it
Right,
poetry?
right.
I mean, it starts like poetry. You have the dashes, but these could be line breaks, and then you have cogent sharp last night, next verse, clear and not much wind. It's quite poetic, and then he starts describing the birds and their songs, and also the language gets musical. He uses musical expressions like intervals, bars, breaks, and then also sound effects like chirping, twittering. Okay, these are ing forms, but to me, they were more like rhymes. Chirping, twittering, and before that, basking.
Drill.
And
Yeah.
and then also onomatopoeia, when you can hear the crunch and cracking, creak, you have the breaking of the ice.
Yeah, the creek, that's great. That alliteration, the occasional crunch and cracking of the creek.
Yes, it's more than just an alliteration. It's onomatopoeia.
Right, sure.
You can hear the cracking of the ice.
Cracking. Yeah, that's fantastic, Mark. Yeah, that's a great reading of the onomatopoeia in that line of the musicality, the crunch and creak, the crunch and cracking of the creek.
And in Football, Walt Whitman, he is in line in the tradition of the transcendentalists. You mentioned Thoreau, Emerson, who have that idea that the poet becomes a seer. He is childlike. He interprets the world to us. No adult would identify the sounds of birds like music, but here Whitman becomes like a child, and he can hear these fascinating melodies. Bird notes. Oh, that's another musical expression I just noticed. Notes.
Did you have something to say, Ton? Were you about?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting that this whole diary entry really speaks of like new discovery. And it's almost like he's discovering sounds again. He is discovering being outside again. And like, if we think about it in the context of recovering after a stroke, this is pretty much how you recover.
Yeah.
Because you need to gain awareness back of how your senses are working. And depending on the severity of the stroke, it would make sense to go somewhere like on a farm, not be in the city, as long as there is some like medical support and whatever, because it's not as intense, but there is still stimulation on which you can focus. And considering that Whitman, like in his, I do this, I do that kind of like listing poems, he talks a lot about city and about, what's going on around and the hustle, bustle, and all of the activity. And here he focuses on the nature and on the sounds again. And it's like it sounded to me almost like a task for the day, which he wanted to start earlier. It was too cold. He had to go back, and then he went outside again when the weather kind of allowed. So that is to me like an entry about like, this is how I am like rediscovering what my body does. And also as a deaf person, it's really interesting to read as well, like this focus on the sound, and on the different qualities of the song and the different qualities of the crunch of the ice, and all of these like sound expressions that Mark mentioned. It was just very interesting to read how much of a focus it becomes.
That's such a good comparison to the the urban fullness of some of the poems, the blab of the pave that characterizes some of the Whitman poems that some of us might be more familiar with, some of the well-known ones. And to kind of to understand this diary entry, to do the biographical reading and understand this as somebody who is recovering, that there's something neurological about what's going on here. There's something about this person, as you said, reacquainting themselves with their senses and setting, Whitman, I think you put it so well, Whitman has set himself the task for the day, and it's difficult. It's even difficult for him to go outside, right? Like it's 9, he wants to get out at 9, it's too cold, he's got to wait till noon, he gets out, he finally gets out there, and it's telling that the diary entry ends there, right, with him sitting next to the creek. That was all that happened that day. There was nothing else to be done, and that was sort of the task, the work of the day contained just in this short journey outside.
And the description of Orion is perfect. Just thinking of last night when walking home and seeing Orion's belt, which is usually the one thing I can recognize of all of them. It's just so descriptive. The many-orbed Orion, sordid, glittering, sordid, yeah.
And chasing with his dog.
Yes, I also really like the attention to detail in this writing. I hadn't read any prose of his before, and I think it's really interesting because I hadn't thought about all this recovery thing when I read it for the first time. But I mean, of course, it's very obvious that he's not perfectly fine health-wise, but I think he's in rather good mood, and I think it's kind of written in a way that he doesn't have to write, well, I'm feeling good today, but instead he describes like nature, and in a way it felt to me as if nature was mirroring him, in a way that he looked at nature and looked at all the bright colors and all the great sounds, and he felt good because all of this kind of looked good or sounded great, and I think that's just a great basically an example for show not tell for a writer. I think he did that really well.
There's a lot of joy in it, isn't there? I mean, even when he's just telling us about the constellation Orion, who's glittering, sordid, chasing with his dog, there's a celebration of what he's seeing in the sky. And the other thing that struck me reading it was I was almost seeing it like an old black and white film, with the moon and the stars and the cold. Yeah, it's very vivid, very visual.
That's right. Nancy, were you about to say something, please?
Yeah, I liked how it skipped over time. We just yesterday had a full moon, and it's cold, and it was windy here too. And I felt like it sort of took time and went and let me sit there with him, because I was like, oh yeah, me too. Oh yeah, look outside. Oh yeah, that's how it is here. And it was kind of an opportunity, which of course diary does wonderfully. It was kind of an opportunity to sit there with Uncle Walt and just be like, yo, it's very good. It's good. Yeah. It's nice. I liked it.
And also I like the way he's equating with his reference to the Rabbi Burns quote, that he's feeling the same pleasure that Rabbi Burns has described in his that little extract.
Yeah,
it's exalting Whitman in the same way. That same connection with nature. That
it goes on.
Yeah, it's the Robert Burns quote is great because he's feeling the same thing. He seems to say I'm kind of I'm on the same wavelength as Burns. But Whitman's day is not a cloudy winter day. It's in fact a very sunny winter day. Right? He talks about the midday brilliance and the sunbeams are breaking up the ice on the creek. It's such an interesting I don't know if there's this sort of kind of geographic boast or something that's happening, right? Where he's like, well, yeah, I mean, those cloudy winter days are all fine and good over on the British Isles or whatever, but here in beautiful southern New Jersey, our Februarys are very sunny, which they are. And that's it's a funny little discrepancy that's being acknowledged in a sideways way here.
don't know, it just reminded me that, again, like I spent almost 2 weeks in bed and I couldn't get out. I couldn't, go anywhere. And then yesterday was like my first real outing outside, and it was like a really big deal, and I had to plan it really well and everything. That was like the thing that I needed to do that day and nothing else pretty much. And like, I remember that it's very similar to what he's describing when it is something that is like a task, you really pay attention, you really like feel, you feel the wind, you look at the stars, you look at the sky, you look at like the people around you or the birds that are singing, or the snow that is like crunching underneath your feet, or like here in the Czech Republic, we don't have snow. So nothing really crunches, but like the way the pavement sounds and everything. So it really also, as Nancy said, yeah, like as in you're sitting with Uncle Walt, like, hey, how did your day go? Let's, oh great, mine went very similarly. Let's talk about it.
It's the heightening of the senses, isn't it? After you've been ill and yeah.
And yeah, in some ways, this like many texts all of a sudden appears to be speaking to the kind of ongoing pandemic lifestyle that we've all gotten accustomed to in the last 2 years. And this is very much there's a sort of like lockdown aspect to this poem as well that I think is while he's talking about he's talking about specific medical thing that happened to him. There's also some folks might be able to relate on those grounds of those early parts of the pandemic, the full lockdowns and what it meant to get out of your home for a couple of hours as the spring was starting.
Still, really, I mean, that's
Sure.
still to a certain extent, it still feels,
Sure.
It's that sense of joy when you actually get out and do something that feels normal.
Right. When,
Or what's normal to your usual routine of things, that you haven't done for such a long time. Yeah.
Any
Talk about the poetry.
Oh, yeah,
Talk
go
about
ahead.
the poetry of it, because if my kids had written this, they would say, we went out, it was a nice day. That would be the diary.
Right.
So this is just absolutely gorgeous. Everything is kind of crocheted together. The language is beautiful.
Right, and he's modeling this, and in some ways that's such a good point about the diary, right? What another diary entry would have been. He's modeling, or he means to model this awareness to the fullness of nature, right? To the aesthetic possibility that comes when you're just when you're kind of a vessel for the beauty of nature, which I think is a very Whitmanian idea. As Mark was saying, that's the transcendentalist idea where you can kind of channel the beauty that's just there already in the natural world, and you don't have to do much more than that. Which is, it goes back to what we were saying about Cage at the very beginning of this conversation. There's this whole tradition in American letters of this idea of like just being able to kind of automatically write if you just get the right mindset or something, right? That Whitman is just, even in his journals, like it appears to be flowing through him or something, right? Like the music and the beauty of what he's seeing and what he's experiencing. It's fascinating. In the few minutes that remain, does anybody want to make a last comment or two on this diary entry from Walt Whitman, February 19th, 1878?
Does anyone think that it's possible to be a poet all your life and not write poetic diary entries, like kind of automatically?
Oh, no.
Probably thinks. I think he didn't. I don't think he tried. I think that's just how it happens.
Oh, Whitman started writing prose, writing novels, but he wasn't quite successful with that, and then he had his great breakthrough with Leaves of Grass.
Yeah. Right, but everything he was going to write was going to be, Whitman after that, right? Like I think it's
right. His first name was, by the way, Walter Whitman. That's the name of the author who wrote the novels. And then when he started Leaves of Grass, he changed his name to Walt.
Wait, he was going by Walter at the beginning?
Walter, yes, Walter Whitman.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
so-
then Leaves of Grass was the first book that he wrote under the name Walt Whitman.
So he got his poet persona. I guess he became a little bit more casual.
But actually Sid's Leaves of Grass too, they are very casual. I mean, his whole style there is,
Yeah.
you know, it's like there's nothing formal there at all. So
Sure.
super. Maybe that's how much does it have to do? Where's success in a name also? I mean, I know that there was years ago, I had some conversation with someone about changing of names and how that had to do with success on a writerly level. That people who wrote under different names, that a change of name could bring success that before wasn't there and never appeared, and how much of that had to do with the actual name of the author, you know, Walter Whitman as opposed to Walt Whitman.
Sure.
Just something to wonder about.
Yeah.
Any final word, comment? No. Thanks everyone. This was that was fun. Well, I'm gonna stop the video.